Khenpo Sodargye.Udāna Sūtra
The supreme, profound and subtle Dharma is rarely encountered in billions of eons. Now we hear and follow it. May we realize the Tathagata's meaning. To liberate beings, please generate bodhicitta before teaching. We will continue our discussion of the Udāna Sūtra. As you may recall, it can be divided into three main sections: the initial meaning, the discourse meaning, and the final meaning. We have already finished our discussion of the initial meaning. Now we are discussing the discourse meaning. There are a total of 33 chapters in the discourse meaning section. Currently, we are now going to move on to discussing the third chapter. The third chapter is the one called the chapter on craving. Because when we consider both the chapter on desire and the chapter on craving are in essence expressing the same idea as we have previously discussed. However, they are explained from a variety of different perspectives. First, we will provide a general explanation that covers all the main concepts. Then, the following chapter will explain them individually and in more detail. Here we can observe that a variety of different perspectives and different analogies are being utilized. This is used to illustrate the powerful emotions of greed or intense craving. However, in reality, it's important to see that it has no fundamental or true nature of its own. If we can truly understand this important point, the situation is precisely as was mentioned a little bit earlier. This applies to all of what is called love, or what is also known as greed and desire. It's just like a fragile bubble of water exposed to the bright sunlight. A beautiful bubble, shimmering in the sunlight, simply cannot last for very long. It will burst in a very short time. In much the same way, in the case that we are dealing with an individual who is actively practicing in this particular field of work, is someone who truly comprehends the fundamental nature of greed and desire in all its forms. In due time, this kind of unchecked greed will, as a natural consequence, inevitably bring about its own destruction, and will naturally be extinguished. This is precisely the reason why, since ancient times, many great and influential masters have placed a great deal of importance on these particular teachings. Many practitioners in the past, as they diligently practiced, eventually truly achieved success. They cut off all of their attachments in this very life and relied on pure discipline, listening, contemplation, and practice. In the end, they also attained realization. Then they benefited countless sentient beings, and throughout their lifetimes, life after life, they were never bound by the concepts of karma and afflictions. Such eminent monks and great masters have also been extremely numerous throughout history. Therefore, when all of the necessary conditions are fully present and in place, it becomes imperative that we explore these matters in a truly comprehensive and profound manner. It is simply not enough to just attend a class or read through a book, because those actions by themselves are not sufficient to gain the required genuine understanding. The key is whether our listening and contemplation can truly and fully penetrate our hearts. This is extremely crucial. If it does not deeply integrate into our hearts, and we only listen to teachings for the sake of listening, or practice for the sake of practicing, or teach for the sake of teaching, such shallow and insubstantial efforts in reality may not have much effect on truly transforming the continuum of our minds. Some people, within a short period of time, after studying just one or two treatises, their entire mental continuum is completely transformed, while others, over many years, may spend years listening to teachings and practicing, yet their own mental continuum never really changes. This includes greed as well. Among us humans, there are the three poisons, namely greed, anger, and ignorance among the three poisons. For some, the more they study, reflect, and practice, the stronger their attachment and craving become. As a result, this brings a great deal of trouble and difficulty, not only to themselves, but also to the people around them. In a similar fashion, for some people, the more they work to cultivate bodhicitta, the more intense and severe their anger seems to become. It's just like what people in the world often say, "I heard that so-and-so is at a certain Buddhist academy," or in some place of practice, they've been cultivating compassion and bodhicitta for so long. But why is your anger still so incredibly intense? And once you finally lose your temper, it seems that absolutely no one can control you. Some people who have never even heard of the Bodhikariyavatara don't have such strong anger at all. Of course, this is a very small minority of people, but this is a failure for a practitioner. It truly means the Dharma hasn't merged with your mind. If the Dharma hasn't merged, then on the surface, no matter what you do, it may not penetrate at all. In this regard, at least on a purely theoretical level, I think everyone here should be very clear about the concept. But when it comes to reality, the established theory and its practical application are often found to be very far apart. In much the same way, what we say and what we actually do are also worlds apart. We often find ourselves talking about the concepts of dreams and reality, and there really is a considerable distance between them. But just talking about it verbally, well, almost anyone can do that. Especially for those who are exceptionally eloquent. They can speak in a very logical and impressive way, and it sounds wonderful. But when it comes to the actual application of this to oneself, just as we have mentioned earlier, it is also found to be quite a challenging undertaking, similar to the various meditation methods described in other treatises.
To
cut off attachment here basically means to be completely free from desire. Oh, I remember, we already talked about this yesterday, right? Here, the essential point to understand is that it is very difficult to cut off attachment directly, so we must instead focus on cutting off its underlying seed. If we can successfully accomplish this, then the result is that there will be no more cause for craving to appear, and consequently, we will not have to revolve in the cycle of samsara ever again. The main point here, the critical insight, is to cut off the seed of attachment. In this way, we can avoid the continuation of cycling within the realm of samsara. That is the essential meaning being conveyed here. This applies when we find ourselves in situations and environments that are pleasant or attractive. In reality, it's very difficult to cut off attachment. Because if you want to cut off attachment, even though followers of non-Buddhist paths practice all kinds of asceticism and various forms of cultivation, especially when you go to Nepal and India, you basically get to know about them. For example, the disciples of the Maheshvara school or the Parinirmita Vashavart in heaven, they are extremely diligent. He was practicing asceticism and cultivation, working day and night without any rest at all. But in reality, they do not have the essential instructions and practices to cut off self-clinging and the root of attachment. So, in this world, it is a fact that many people find it very difficult to cut off their feelings of attachment. And this also includes all the mental factors that are directly related to that attachment. Therefore, we must eliminate its seeds, which can be understood as the continuum of attachment, or alternatively, the most fundamental cause and the original seed of that attachment. Otherwise, this defiled mind, much like relentless weeds in springtime, will continue to arise within you again and again, never truly being put to rest. Therefore, if the defiled mind is not completely severed at its very root, and you merely focus on removing its branches and fruits, then it will inevitably and quickly grow back once more. Therefore, it is essential that we try every possible way to completely cut off the seed of attachment at its very root. Because if you can successfully cut off this foundational seed, then this deep-seated craving will not be able to arise. Because through observation, by observing we use discerning cessation, and if we eliminate it through the method of discerning cessation, it will never again have the chance to arise in samsara. This is because if its seed or its continuum is cut off, it can be completely and utterly eradicated. Otherwise, even if one attains temporary meditative concentration, upon reaching the profound realm of neither perception nor non-perception, which is also known as the very peak of existence, even such highly evolved celestial beings will eventually revive the fundamental seed. Later on, when he encounters that same object again, he is then able to recall it. You could say it's like being bitten by a mouse in winter. After the initial event of being bitten has occurred, at a later point in time, when the first spring thunder begins to rumble, and by relying on this particular set of external conditions, all the scenes and memories from one's own personal continuum at that time can completely and vividly reappear. In the same way, if we do not get to the very source of the problem and cut it off at the root, there is a very high probability that it will manifest itself once again later on. So, generally speaking, for the average person, on the one hand, it may be practically impossible to completely cut off its seed. If you have not cut off its seed on the surface, you may appear to be practicing, you may seem to be especially diligent, but ultimately, in the end, it is still very difficult to eliminate it entirely. Some people may indeed be especially attached to worldly intentions and worldly defiled objects. They may be clinging to these ideas with great intellectual intensity, but in reality, they haven't truly put them into consistent practice, nor have they successfully integrated these principles into their day-to-day life. In some of Changyang Gyatso's spiritual songs, it is also said, "When I meditate on calm abiding and superior insight, the face of the Buddha which should appear does not appear, while the face of my beloved lover, which should not appear at this moment, is so incredibly vivid before my eyes. If only I could turn this wandering mind toward the sacred path, how could the great goal of attaining Buddhahood in this very single life be difficult? And if I could direct this same diligence toward the profound learning of the Dharma, perhaps even achieving Buddhahood in this very life would not be so difficult." So, when Nan Huai-Chin explained these principles at the time, he said that a true practitioner may be able to transform circumstances with their mind, rather than having the mind be changed by external circumstances. Fundamentally, it is our mind that should transform the external world. If the mind is always swayed by external circumstances, then there's nothing we can do. So, if we truly and sincerely want to engage in our practice, it is actually of the utmost importance to cut off our afflictions at the very root. The great master Ying Guang also shared a teaching back in the day, saying that if one recites the Buddha's name with the same heartfelt passion as for a lover, then attaining Buddhahood is indeed more than just possible. If one's recitation of the Buddha's name is as intense as their longing for a lover, then attaining Buddhahood is more than achievable. If all our attachment to romantic feelings were instead directed toward the Dharma or reciting the Buddha's name, then even attaining Buddhahood in this very lifetime would be more than possible. So, for example, consider all the time that we spend engaged in worldly activities, such as chatting casually, or spending our time sleeping in, or allowing ourselves to be distracted. If all of that valuable time were instead used to consciously cut off our feelings of desire and anger, or if we were to put effort into the important practice of eliminating improper thoughts, we would definitely make great progress in our mental continuum. But in reality, in our daily lives, this is definitely not such a simple thing to do in reality. Therefore, it is specifically said here that the act of cutting off desire is truly not so easy to accomplish. However, if we start by addressing its root causes, then in the future we won't have to be reborn in samsara. Actually, none of us really wants to return to the cycle of rebirth, and we fundamentally wish to leave samsara behind. But there are also some people who feel that samsara is wonderful, especially some young people whose hearts have not been touched by the Dharma, and some people with a very critical mindset. They always seem to feel that real life is just so beautiful, that there is absolutely no suffering or any worry here, and that it would be fine to return to samsara again. There are a few people like this, but they truly do not know what the true nature of samsara really is. If you truly understood its reality, then you might not make such a wish. So for those of us whose hearts have truly been touched by the Dharma, the outer and inner worlds of sentient beings and their environments, when examined with a meticulous method of observation, there truly is nothing worth being attached to. Although people, regardless of their values, the food they eat, the clothes they wear, or the objects of their attachment, these all seem very beautiful on the surface. and appear to truly exist. However, when you observe them with the profound wisdom that discerns the true nature of all things, these events that people so often call wonderful phenomena are actually revealed to be as transient as bubbles or as hollow and without any real lasting substance, much like a plantain tree. There really is no meaning to them. At this point, a sense of renunciation will naturally arise within your mind stream. So once you have developed renunciation, all the subsequent states and experiences can arise one after another. If you lack this foundation, as everyone should know, it may be very difficult to practice. Many people, as they continue practicing, end up giving up halfway through. They say, practice is so hard, I just can't make progress. It's like some people who, when they reach high mountains, experience altitude sickness. Then halfway up they start taking in some oxygen and end up turning back, just like that. The path of a practitioner sometimes seems very long and drawn out. In the middle, you just can't seem to make any progress, and eventually you start heading back down the mountain yourself. There are quite a lot of people like this. Some people find it a bit difficult to get going at first, but they become more and more diligent as they go on. It's like in a horse race. Some horses lag behind at first, but at a certain point they charge forward with all their might, and in the end no one can keep up with them. A true practitioner is just like that. It's like a marathon or a horse race. It is a competition along a very long road. During this entire process of competition, some people become more and more outstanding over time. They overcome many pitfalls and challenges and ultimately surpass all expectations. Meanwhile, other people, as they walk through life, encounter all kinds of traps and difficulties, and in the end have ultimately no choice but to turn back. So here it also talks about the drawbacks of not cutting off greed.
다름줄 치즈 마잔 바르 건거 하당 말남스 동니르 장네 죽시에 바 이르락체 바 데레 거 데레 거.
Sometimes these Tibetan verses are easy to understand, but sometimes they are difficult. If there were no commentaries and you were asked to explain directly, it wouldn't be that easy to understand. I'm sure you have all seen the Chinese translation done by Tian Shizai, right? How do you feel when you compare it with the original Tibetan version? So you see, on some occasions, the Tibetan language isn't particularly easy to understand either, but sometimes it's okay. Do not waste your precious human life through craving human and divine rewards bound tight by attachment's rope. One must transcend desire's realm. That is to say, we have indeed successfully obtained such a precious human life, just as it is described in some of the guiding texts. It's extremely, extremely rare. This precious human life is one that possesses the 10 endowments and the 8 freedoms. A human life, complete with all of these 18 freedoms and advantages, is exceptionally difficult to obtain. But when we do obtain such a human life, it is best not to let it go to waste or squander it away for nothing. Otherwise, it would be truly a real pity. Typically speaking, when people lose something of importance, for instance, their gold, silver, or valuables, or, as another example, if they happen to lose their most cherished phone or their personal computer, it's almost as if they've lost their very own heart. It's just incredibly heartbreaking. But actually, there might still be a chance to recover those things. But as for our human life, indeed, as described in the relevant spiritual practices, it is truly and extremely rare. If we do not make good and proper use of this precious human life, if we do not practice diligently and well, or use it with genuine wisdom, then, just as it is said in the Nagarjuna's letter to a friend, it's like obtaining a golden vessel, but not using it properly. And instead it was being turned into a container for all filth. If you use it to hold filth, then even ordinary people would surely find that to be utterly ridiculous. Therefore, in this world, we must not waste our precious human life in vain. Otherwise, whether it's many people or even celestial beings, these sentient beings all have their own desires. What kind of desires are these? For example, people in the desire realm have many cravings, such as the 5 kinds of sensual pleasures: sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touch. They have all sorts of goals and desires. As for the form and formless realms, they too pursue certain meditative states. In the form realm, there are 17 heavens, each with its own meditative heaven. They have 4 levels of meditative heavens, each with its own meditative bliss. They seek after these states. As for the formless realm, there is nothing material, no physical forms at all. However, they too have their own very different pursuits. If that's the case, then all sentient beings in the three realms are tightly bound by the ropes of attachment and craving, and are placed within the cycle of the 6 realms of samsara, preventing you from attaining liberation. The primary reason we are unable to attain liberation is because we are bound by our afflictions. For example, consider the fish in a river. It sees what appears to be some food, a tempting morsel of food for the fish. Then, almost immediately, as soon as it goes to eat it, the fish is caught and falls into the hands of the fisherman, and it cannot escape. No matter how much it desperately struggles, it cannot break free from the firm grip. It will never be able to do so. Finally return to the free-flowing river where it once belonged. In the same way, the sentient beings within the 3 realms of existence are also in a very pitiable state. Each one becomes attached to the various objects and experiences of their own realm. Once they become attached in this way, they are unable to attain true liberation on their own. Therefore, after we have obtained a human body, we must absolutely never allow ourselves to be bound and controlled by these external objects of desire. Instead, we should actively work to transcend the powerful cravings and the persistent desires we feel for these very same objects. This is very important. If we can truly and completely break free from the bondage of such worldly attachments, then there is indeed a genuine hope for attaining ultimate liberation. Therefore, the Sutra of the Right Mindfulness of Dharma also says that when one is free from the sense of self and from all forms of desire, if one is free from desire, one can reach the city of nirvana. Such a person, whether at the beginning, middle, or end, attains purity. Therefore, from the place of happiness, one attains happiness. From a starting point of genuine joy, one gains a lasting state of happiness. We should first free ourselves from attachment to desire, craving, and the notion of self. By making the conscious and deliberate choice to break free from such attachments, after letting go, there is hope of entering the city of nirvana. In this way, our practice can have a much greater opportunity to achieve success. Therefore, as a person who is truly known for their great wisdom, one really should not waste this precious human body on pursuits or activities that are utterly meaningless. In today's conversations about technology, there's a significant amount of focus on what are considered the top-tier smartphones. These are the flagship models that boast the absolute highest specifications, which in turn makes them the most advanced and capable phones currently available on the market. But if your primary intention is to only use it for creating short videos or just for making calls, then you are not making full use of it. Because, you see, it has a truly countless number of different features, and it's worth mentioning that some of these features are in fact exceptionally good. But if you don't use any of them and spend all day just doing things to your body, to your eyes, that are actually very harmful to your own body and your life, then that is certainly a very foolish way to act. Because whether it's your smartphone or your personal computer, if it has high-end specifications, at least in theory, simply by relying on it, you could accomplish all sorts of genuinely meaningful things, but for some reason you don't actually do that. You have the very best quality phone, without a single doubt, but you use it in the worst way. In this case, even in the eyes of the world, it might seem quite ridiculous. Seriously, take a look. He went and bought this incredibly expensive high-end smartphone. But it seems that apart from watching boring videos on it every single day, he doesn't actually use it for any other purpose at all. The whole situation is just laughable. Normally, if we just have an old beat-up phone, then after that is complete, you can simply use it to make your phone calls. Since its quality isn't great and it's not worth much anyway, that's still fine. But as for our human life, if you decide to use it to do something truly meaningful, then you can genuinely accomplish anything at all. You can achieve the goals of the lower, middle, and higher paths. Both liberation and nirvana can be attained through this human life. So sometimes, when we really look at some of the great masters and accomplished practitioners of the past, they devoted their entire lives either to their own spiritual practice or to benefiting sentient beings. Other than that, generally speaking, they wouldn't do anything meaningless, let alone do anything that would harm sentient beings. For them, even if it meant sacrificing their own precious lives, they would still be completely unwilling to do so. So, whether we are devout monastics or sincere lay practitioners, any believer who has been fortunate enough to obtain this precious human life, perhaps those who study Buddhism know, especially those who have listened to the guidance on the preliminary practices, that a human life is truly hard to obtain. But this human life will also be left behind very quickly in a very short time. Within this very brief period of time, we should use it for the sake of liberation in this life and future lives, or in matters that greatly benefit all sentient beings. Then it is truly and genuinely valuable. If we don't do this, then it is possible that it will be just as Milarepa once said to the hunter Khenpo Sodargye. Originally, the Buddha himself said that a human life is very difficult to obtain, but seeing someone like you, who uses a human life to commit such negative karma, it seems that a human life is not so hard to obtain after all. This statement is quite similar in meaning. Next, let's now talk about Pay attention to the Tibetan and Chinese versions, as they are more difficult. Sentient beings are born in hell. When freedoms and advantages are lost, they regret it. The ocean of samsara is caused by attachment to desire and the basis of sores. Is it better to use nai or ji here? When I was translating this, I genuinely pondered over it for really quite a long while. However, it's possible the term ji is a more appropriate choice, specifically the full phrase ji chuang ji. The reason for this is because within this commentary, the term connects to the preceding half of the verse. In this case, the verse states that sentient beings are born in hell, and it is only after the precious freedoms and advantages have been lost that they come to experience deep regret. Maybe it can also be connected with the previous verse, but if you look at it literally, it seems that even as a single verse it can be explained. The meaning is that because we first develop desire, after desire arises, we become careless and indulgent, and after becoming indulgent, we start to create negative karma. After creating a significant amount of negative karma, these sentient beings are subsequently reborn in the hell realms. If they are reborn in one of these hells, their situation becomes truly pitiful. There, they continuously experience this immense suffering, seemingly without any end. Through this understanding, you eventually come to realize that you once had a precious human life with leisure and opportunity, but now that precious human life has already been lost. At this point you feel especially regretful. Some practitioners in their younger years, because they are more lively and somewhat ignorant, may not feel the full consequences at the time. But as time goes on, and when many of these people grow old, that's when they begin to understand. They realize that when they were young, there were actually many things they shouldn't have done that way, and they shouldn't have created such karma. It seems like we often see this as well, that some elderly people become more and more aware of it, especially when they encounter certain major social changes at the time. Some people just follow the crowd in those moments, and if they created a lot of negative karma, they now deeply regret it. Some regret it at the moment of death, while others feel regret even before dying. When they reach the hell realms, sometimes beings in hell may realize that it was all created by their actions in previous lives. Even if they haven't fallen into hell, even here in the human world, some people experience suffering that is just like being in hell, whether it's the pain of illness, the suffering of poverty, or the torment inflicted by others. Don't we talk about the cold hells and the hot hells? As for the hot hells, in fact, even in this human world at this present time, some people are indeed also enduring the suffering and pain of the hot hells. And I have always observed this. Sometimes I watch it, not all the time though. Otherwise I really wouldn't have any personal time left for myself to unwind. To provide a clear example, let's consider the case of the former South Korean presidential couple. They're now locked up in a place where the weather is extremely hot, and there's not even a fan at times like this. It seems that just last year, the clothes they wore and the food they ate were things the whole world envied. But then this year, quite suddenly, both of the presidents who were at that time in office ended up being locked in prison. Right now, they're probably still in what's called a detention center, not a full prison yet. At this very moment, including the place where they're staying. Honestly, people can really be too much sometimes. Back when you remember everyone treated them so incredibly well. Wow, everyone liked them so much, it was unbelievable. And then all of a sudden you find that the law no longer allows you to do practically anything. At times like this, some say it's a pain like being in hell. But looking at them, they have become so incredibly thin, it is really something quite remarkable. So sometimes in this world, even though maybe they didn't really practice any spiritual cultivation, if they were Buddhists maybe, wow, this is the karma from my past life. It's time for me to contemplate impermanence. Maybe this is when I deserve to die. Contemplate and meditate on death and impermanence. Transform suffering into the path. Practice exchanging self and others. Develop bodhicitta and so on. If they have absolutely no such concepts, then truly, in their hearts, they might feel worse than death. If they were to fall into hell, they might experience the same kind of feeling. So such people might also feel especially regretful. And here, what is mainly being discussed is that having lost the precious human life with leisure and opportunity, they feel regret. Then in the great ocean of samsara is like an ocean. Here, ocean actually refers to a river. Because when it comes to a river, it has the characteristics of being moist and of flowing. So this river of attachment, along with the causes and effects of attachment and samsara, also have the qualities of being unstable and perpetually moist. Moistened by the objects of attachment, this may very well be the case. So the ultimate cause here is the objects of attachment and the very basis of our sores. The objects of attachment, the things we are attached to, come in many forms. For example, sights, sounds, smells, tastes, touches, and so on. There are all kinds of objects. And as for the fundamental basis of sores, it is absolutely the body filled with all sorts of various diseases and all kinds of different impurities. For a clear example, right here, when a person is still developing in the mother's womb, they are in fact also surviving within an inherently impure environment. And after a person is born, you'll find their body is also composed of all sorts of things like pus, blood, yellow fluid, and other similarly impure substances. So what does this ultimately mean? What is the main cause of being reborn in samsara? It is the specific objects of attachment, as well as one's own and others' physical bodies. This way it can be explained as such. Perhaps this explanation is a bit better. I also looked at the commentary, but in the commentary there are two possible explanations. In Tibetan there is no word for and as in as well as. There isn't such a word. It just directly says, at first it was written as Nai Chuang Ji, but Nai Chuang Ji is difficult to explain. Why is it difficult? If the cause of the ocean of samsara is the object of attachment, and if the object of attachment is the body, it seems as if all objects of attachment become the body. It's a bit difficult to explain it this way. The meaning is that the cause of our samsara is attachment. The objects of attachment are various kinds, including one's own body, as well as other phenomena. All of these are considered objects of attachment. In this way, because it is continuous and unbroken, for example, the ever-flowing stream of delusion is hard to sever, and alas, this leads to the continuity of suffering. There's also a bit more at the beginning of the Bodhikariyavatara, but I've forgotten it. It refers to the river of confusion that is not easily cut off. Our shared suffering, unfortunately, continues onward in what feels like a completely unbroken stream. So this is what samsara is like. Its underlying cause continues without interruption, and that is precisely why such states of suffering, such profound pain, such conditions are truly pitiable, not just elsewhere, but within our own human world as well. Consequently, this realization can lead us to become more aware of profound concepts such as the nature of impermanence or the driving force of desire, which is a condition that is known to be a particularly troublesome and challenging affliction. Even though it's something we do not want and try to push away, it remains a constant presence that always follows us. If we diligently practice, given the right approach and the necessary resources, we believe it should be possible to eliminate it entirely, and that is the central idea. This is also employing a metaphor in order to illustrate the inherent faults of desire and clearly expressing the absolute necessity to sever it completely. Covered by a web of vines, if the heat of affliction is not subdued, one will repeatedly experience this suffering, never truly being able to bring it to an end. Whether the cause is rooted in worldly greed or the 62 kinds of speculative views, these are like a dense and entangling web of vines. As for this web of vines, it grows to envelop the mind. In some tourist spots in Han region, they use fresh flowers to make decorations, and then there are all kinds of vines around them used for decoration and to surround the area. There are such things. But actually, when it comes to vines, if you use them as a metaphor for a net, if they cover you, then there's nothing you can do. It may look very nice on the surface, but in reality, no one can escape from it. For example, when individuals are engaged in the activity of hunting birds in the modern era, many hunters use all kinds of nets in order to capture them. It looks as if decorating with flower garlands is very pleasing and eye-catching, but in reality, once you go in, there's nothing you can do. So the particular afflictions that are actually encompassed by these vines right here, as for these afflictions, it's the insatiable greed in our hearts, this kind of greed. If we don't subdue it, don't abandon it, don't cut it off by using the antidotes of the path of practice and the path of seeing, if we don't cut it off, then we will repeatedly experience this suffering. In the endless cycle of samsara, again and again, continuously and repeatedly, all kinds of suffering arise. This pervasive state of suffering will never cease or be destroyed on its own without its root causes being addressed. The mental defilement of greed is an extremely evil force, and it is this powerful craving that leads people down the path to the immense suffering found in the hell realms. We not only suffer in the realms of hungry ghosts and animals, but the most severe and destructive kind of greed may cause us to be tormented in the hell realms, a state of unimaginable and intense pain. Therefore, it is imperative that we see clearly the true unsatisfactory nature of samsara and recognize the nature of our mental afflictions. And also know that within our own minds, we actually possess the inherent wisdom to counteract them. However, not every person is able to attain this particular kind of wisdom. For example, if there is a mountain of treasures, a truly wise person will dig out its precious gems. If one lacks wisdom, a person will see the treasure mountain as just a completely ordinary rocky mountain, and thus will never be able to obtain the true value that lies deep within it. Nowadays, there are many precious stones in the world which appear to be just ordinary rocks at first glance. But those who are wise, those who observe, those who explore, know that they are incredibly valuable. In the same way, our mind is truly like a wish-fulfilling jewel. However, many people who lack wisdom are unable to recognize the immense value and potential of their own mind. This is also something we all should understand.
Bernard Johnson, Stanley Maptona, Jetting Shirjan, Jeva Conner, that Division of Trip Chargy Maptona, Trip Chargy Maptona, Yanda, Dinger, Dummerdo.
Sometimes there are a great many words in Tibetan, and at other times there are actually very few. If you do not uproot the tree, even if you cut it down, it will grow again. If you do not eliminate the latent tendencies, this suffering will never cease. This refers to the afflictions in our mental continuum, which are mainly rooted in attachment and clinging. This metaphor is used to illustrate the point. If we do not completely uproot the tree from the ground, it will inevitably and relentlessly keep growing back again and again. This is true even if we use a tool like an axe or a saw, or other specialized tools to cut down the tree. You will find that even after you have cut it down, it will persistently keep growing back from its base again and again. In the same way, if we do not rely on the profound wisdom of selflessness, or if we do not utilize wisdom to cut off the underlying latent tendencies, here the latent tendencies mainly refer to the afflictions of attachment and the bonds they create, what we call the bondage of the 9 fetters. If we do not completely and utterly sever them, then all the sufferings of this world will never ever be able to come to a definitive end. Because even those of non-Buddhist paths have all kinds of ascetic practices, as well as various forms of meditation, but ultimately they are still unable to do so. The most important thing is to cut it off at the root. If we do not cut it off at the root, we cannot escape samsara. This is also stated in the Sutra of the Right Mindfulness of Dharma. It is said that people are fundamentally bound by what is known as attachment, and cannot escape the continuous cycle of birth and death. Therefore, we who live in this world are primarily bound by this powerful force of attachment, which ultimately prevents us from breaking free. And for this very reason, all around the entire world, many people will often regard it as a particularly beautiful word and would frequently praise and describe it in great detail. In the distant past, in the famous land of Benares, there once lived a king. He, along with his entire retinue, was indulging in the many pleasures within the garden. At that time, 500 sages who had practiced austerities for a long time were flying through the air using their own supernatural powers. At that moment, they tasted delicious food and heard beautiful sounds. Because they developed some greed at that time, as a result, they eventually lost their supernatural powers. All of them tumbled down into the garden far below. They all landed safely on the ground. At that very moment, the king, who continued to hold on to his unwavering faith, said, just like how we often say Amitabha Buddha and pay homage to the Buddha, as a sign of deference, he offered them respect using such titles. Because in ancient India, kings, in ancient times, it seemed people would show great respect and make generous offerings to Brahmins, sages, and monastics. They would respectfully make these offerings and pay sincere homage in this way. However, in our modern times, many high-ranking officials around the world seem to view religious figures and practitioners as more of an inconvenience or even a thorn in their side. To them, it's quite clear that these people are nothing more than an unsightly eyesore. The core values of this entire world have simply changed, after all. Looking back to ancient times, it seems that no matter which historical records we consult, they all describe the situation in a very similar fashion. And so, at that moment, after hearing this account, these wise sages also developed faith in the Buddha in their hearts. After hearing the Buddha's name, subsequently, they later began to sincerely pay their respects and show homage to the Buddha, and after they had completed this act, the Buddha also taught them the Dharma, and in the end, they all attained realization. It should be about this teaching, I suppose. So the Buddha also recited this verse, and there are such accounts. There is, however, another version of this story. In this telling, there was a caretaker who was responsible for looking after a beautiful orchard. He would often observe that within the grounds of his garden, many different people would frequently come to rest and find comfort in the cool shade of the trees. There was a particular tree which was a poisonous tree, a toxic one. The people who rested under this tree would often suffer from headaches, stomach aches, and all sorts of illnesses. And so, over time, these people gradually departed. Later, the caretaker thought to himself, this tree might be very bad. So he thought about using a long axe to cut down the tree. But after he cut it down, the tree grew back again. Every time he chopped it down, it would start growing again, and once it was fully grown, when many people came to rest in its shade, they would once again meet with misfortune again and again. Eventually, he became quite distressed, because his wife and his children, all of them had died because of this tree. He was in a lot of pain and began to cry himself. Then along the path he met a wise man. He asked him, "Why is it that I chop down this tree every day, yet the tree keeps growing back? It brings me so much trouble." The wise man said, "You are cutting it the wrong way. If you want to get rid of the tree, you should uproot it from the roots. If you don't dig out the roots, no matter how many times you chop it down, it won't work. But at this point, because uprooting it from the roots, what does it require? It requires getting close to it. But if he gets close, he realizes he's in danger himself. In the end, he really had no other choice. So he eventually went to the Buddha and made the decision to become a monk. At that time, it's worth noting, there were also other cases like this, where people would become monks when they genuinely had no other way out. Even in many movies nowadays, when someone really can't go on anymore, they choose to become a monk. So in the 1960s and 70s, whenever people saw someone become a monk, they assumed that person must have encountered some trouble in life. That is what everyone thought. But now, things are a little better. So after he became a monk at that time, the Buddha then recited this particular verse for the person, and upon hearing it, this person also attained the profound state of enlightenment. In the end, he successfully achieved the final fruition of sainthood, and there are other similar cases like this. So, when we are speaking from these two stories, if we genuinely desire to completely eliminate these afflictions, and if we have not thoroughly uprooted them from their fundamental source, then it is simply not possible. If there is no mind of emptiness, once extinguished, they will arise again. As it says in the Bodhicharyavatara, if there is no mind of emptiness, once extinguished, they will arise again. If there is no understanding of emptiness, even if the afflictions are temporarily extinguished, like the gods in the highest heavens, they can remain in meditative absorption or cessation for a very long time. However, it is important to recognize that eventually the ingrained habitual tendencies in their own mental continuum will inevitably revive. Therefore, if you haven't eradicated them from their very root, any temporary suppression will prove unhelpful. They will certainly revive and arise again. That is the essential point. Next. It's just like carefully making a weapon all by yourself and then even being killed by a thief with that very same weapon. The craving that arises in the mind ends up harming countless sentient beings. This is also a metaphor. In the situation where a person creates a weapon themselves, the commentary here elaborates on this point. It explains that the word oneself is used to signify that the action was performed by that specific individual and not by any other person. Consequently, this confirms that the weapon was not made by someone else, but that you have actually made the weapon yourself. Oneself in this context means yourself. If you make the weapon all by yourself later on, if there are any thieves or robbers, these individuals, relying on their own capabilities, eventually succeed in taking possession of the very weapon you created. This situation mirrors a scenario we see on the global stage today, where the advanced weaponry they developed for themselves ironically falls into the hands of their adversaries and ultimately destroy themselves. Then, on closer look, the original factory was built by themselves, and then they sold it elsewhere. After selling it to other places, other powerful countries use these weapons, and the ones who start attacking you are exactly these people. It's just like being harmed by the weapons you made yourself. The greed that arises in the minds of sentient beings is also self-generated. It's not caused by some other being like Mahabrahma or Indra, nor is it produced by anything else external. In some other religions, they say things like God makes you feel greed or anger, but in reality that's not the case. It is within our own mental continuum as sentient beings that such greed arises. Well, once this particular feeling of greed arises, it harms other sentient beings and also harms ourselves. Because relying on attachment and karma, when these two combine, absolutely everything is destroyed. However, many people genuinely think that having craving and attachment is something that is meaningful. In fact, attachment in particular is often seen as something very meaningful. The Buddha actually spoke specifically for people who find themselves in this very kind of situation. There is a story of a blacksmith from the past who would forge weapons every day and made his entire living by selling them. That was how he survived. One time he had skillfully made an exceptionally fine sword. He then took this very sword with him. As he was venturing out on his way, he unfortunately encountered a group of bandits. During the ensuing struggle that followed, a critical moment occurred where his own sword was lost and fell into the hands of an opponent. Ultimately, this same enemy took possession of the sword and tragically used it to strike him down, ending his life with his very own weapon. Then, to make matters worse, all his money and possessions were completely stolen as well. So, regarding this incident, the Buddha himself also spoke this verse. This is one explanation that is found within our traditional commentaries. There is another plausible explanation, which is that in the distant past, some hunters would strategically set up traps, often in the form of large nets, so that various animals like deer, muntjacs, and other creatures of the forest would inadvertently get caught and become entangled, which was a method allowing them to successfully capture these animals. But at some point, by accident, ironically, the hunters themselves fell into their very own traps. Many of them died because of this. Those who managed to survive also endured a great deal of suffering. Later on, some of them made the choice to become monks. This really illustrates that sometimes you can find all kinds of people within the Buddhist faith. Even hunters go and become monks. People who are unsuccessful in their worldly affairs may also end up becoming monks. And so, we can't always be complaining about the state of movies today. In Buddhist stories, some people who were unsuccessful went to the Buddha to become monks, after ordaining, because they themselves, on one hand, these individuals still retained the ingrained habits and spiritual obstacles from their past as hunters, and as a result, their karmic burden was quite heavy. Furthermore, these monks were not particularly diligent in their spiritual practice. At that time, the Buddha also did not specifically say how the hunter was eventually able to attain liberation. The Buddha, therefore, in response to these situations, actually said, "You are harming yourselves. You are attached to your own desires." Now that you have all become monks, if you are not truly diligent, it is ultimately also meaningless. At that time, the Buddha also taught this very same verse. So the meaning of this verse is actually that sentient beings are indeed very, very pitiable. They end up harming themselves. Nowadays, some young people in cities are really like this. They are especially attached to so-called love. For the sake of love, they are willing to pay any price. They can even give up their heads, eyes, brains, and marrow. There's nothing they wouldn't sacrifice. In the end, they ruin themselves because of this. Others are also ruined because of it. But in reality, this is an extremely foolish kind of attachment. This attachment makes it seem like there is nothing more valuable than this, and apart from this, there is no way out. They have this kind of misguided thought, but there's nothing that can be done about it. On one hand, all sentient beings are born with this kind of affliction. Consequently, given the limited time frame, it is certainly not a simple or straightforward undertaking to bring this matter to an immediate halt. So sometimes it is truly just like the story of the blacksmith who made his own weapons and ended up killing himself with them. Actually, in my very own hometown, there was a very similar case. There was a man who was especially skilled at making hunting rifles. As a result, he made a lot of hunting rifles himself. Other people deliberately bought his rifles, and then they proceeded to kill him with them. They intentionally made him use his very own gun to kill himself. Such terrible things, unfortunately, do happen. So if we do not recognize the true nature of our mind, if we do not recognize our own afflictions, many people will suffer greatly, and then complain that external circumstances have brought them all kinds of suffering and adversity. But in reality, it is their own uncontrollable delusions. These delusions are not being dealt with or remedied. Because of this, it's as if they go mad themselves. And then their entire perspective on the world changes. In the end, both self-destruction and harming others can occur. Such phenomena do exist. There was once a person who worked on algorithms. He kept developing algorithms himself, making others become addicted, making it possible for people to get hooked. In the end, he didn't end up harming others, but his own daughter actually became addicted and eventually committed suicide. Such phenomena are actually very common. Sometimes you will find that the actual teachings of the Buddha, even though they are ancient thoughts from over 2,000 years ago, when applied to the present day, nowadays we basically understand the sufferings and joys of the world, as well as all kinds of separations, the many different pains and various forms of happiness. Ultimately, we come to know all of these things. Things like gain and loss too. When we understand these, we can completely connect the teachings of Buddhism with the real-life sufferings and joys of all sentient beings, as well as their own personal delusions. When these two elements are ultimately combined, wow, it really brings a wonderfully and particularly refreshing feeling. Moreover, its effect is something many people today can reflect upon. When reflecting on it, for those whose habitual tendencies are strong and whose karma is heavy, no matter how many times you tell them, 100 times, 200 times, perhaps there won't be even the slightest change in their mental continuum. There's simply no change. But for those whose past karma is not so severe and who have some virtuous connections or affinity with Buddhism, when these kinds of people receive the Buddha's profound teachings, it becomes especially effective for them. It is like fertile seeds in the springtime receiving the gentle rain and sweet nectar, and then the tender sprouts are almost immediately nourished. In this there is such great hope. Therefore, it is for this reason that when we are reading these important Buddhist scriptures, we find a similar potential for growth. If we take time to observe them in detail, it is possible that they are actually very meaningful. Know that such attachment gives rise to all suffering and afflictions. Cut off attachment and cease grasping. Be mindful and practice universally like the Sangha. This is the last verse of this chapter. It also serves as a summary. So what does this actually mean? Because as we established earlier, we analyzed extensively that this concept we call attachment is in fact a kind of emotional affliction. And it is also a kind of knot, a kind of bondage. If we truly observe its essential nature, we will find that it arises from our own deluded thoughts. And in actuality, there is nothing fundamentally real about it. But when you are not directly observing it, it feels remarkably real and genuinely tangible, almost as if it is something that is completely unbreakable and exceptionally solid. So as for this attachment, in reality, it is truly just such an illusion, a very powerful illusion. It has harmed countless sentient beings, especially, and I think perhaps, as the wise ancients once said, what is called love might not have been valued so much. This naturally includes us Tibetans, the so-called love that people in today's society are so troubled by each and every day. These things, and while it is true that every ordinary person experiences these kinds of emotions, it is not as beautiful as society sometimes makes it out to be, nor is it quite as serious as society often claims. It is merely a law of cause and condition. But people in the world don't see it this way. Whether it's so-called love or desire, they are especially attached to it. Because once it arises, all kinds of human suffering and personal faults are born from it. This is a fundamental truth about all sorts of suffering, and it is something that everyone should know. Monastics who are without attachment to worldly love, and some dedicated lay practitioners, choose to live very simple lives. Their behavior in all aspects is very proper and remains in full accordance with the teachings of the Dharma. Because of this desire, even in this life, some people ultimately end up being controlled by kings, while some spend their entire lives in prison. And for some, even though they haven't actually ended up in prison, they live lives that can feel worse than death, suffering every day because of it. For these individuals, when these things happen, they find they cannot rest during the day or get any real sleep at night. And in the end, their whole body is ruined. This kind of phenomenon is very common. So if you truly understand the genuine nature of love, you will see that it actually gives rise to all kinds of suffering and faults. If you can cut off attachment, if we can completely eliminate that attachment with wisdom, then there will be no more grasping. Grasping, upadana, grasping at sensual desires, grasping at views, and grasping at rites and rituals. These are also mentioned in the Abhidharma Kosha and other texts. There is also one called grasping at verbal expressions of self. Non-Buddhists believe in the existence of a self and express it through language. So these 5 types of grasping are also possible, or samsara is also called the 5 aggregates subject to grasping. Depending on the aggregates subject to grasping, one continuously cycles through existence. This is also called grasping, upadana. If we can observe this with genuine wisdom, then with that wisdom there is no real attachment. There is a line in the Buddha's last teaching sutra, which we have translated before. If there is wisdom, there is no attachment. If one possesses wisdom, there is no attachment. If there is no wisdom, not only does attachment exist, but it is also extremely fierce and very difficult to overcome. This is the situation. Therefore, if we use the profound wisdom of no self, it is in order to completely cut off our deep-seated attachments. Then there will be no grasping and no suffering of samsara. So, such a mindful monk who possesses the 4 foundations of mindfulness, in Tibetan it is bhikshu, but the word count is a bit different. Sangha, the monastic community. Sangha means bhikshu. It also means universally practicing, or nirvana without remainder. Some interpretations say that Sangha refers to nirvana with remainder. The meaning is that if we cut off attachment, then the cycle of samsara in this world will not continue to turn. Furthermore, such a practitioner can attain both the nirvana with remainder and the nirvana without remainder in this world, and can also achieve complete freedom. Or in other words, such a monk universally practices, and if it is universal practice, there are no obstacles at all, and they can travel everywhere to benefit sentient beings. This can also be explained according to the Mahayana interpretation. Such a monk who possesses right mindfulness, even if you are in a particularly dangerous environment, if his mind is free from defilements and he has cut off such attachment, many arhats, although they do not benefit sentient beings to the extent that Mahayana bodhisattvas do, still, many practitioners with a certain level of realization can go to any city, enter any group of people, without having to live with so many worries or so much fear all the time. Some of us monastics are extremely anxious, afraid of everything and everyone, but if one truly upholds their precepts and uses right understanding and right mindfulness to guard the sense doors, that is very good. But if that's not needed and you worry about everything, thinking, oh, this isn't okay, that isn't okay, and are especially anxious, actually this may be a sign of anxiety disorder. A true practitioner is feeling very relaxed and truly at ease, and is without a great deal of sorrow or affliction. Such a bhikshu is therefore a genuine practitioner of the way. So, and that brings us to the conclusion of chapter 3.
Om